G'day, I'm Owen, you've joined the pub test, and before we get started into this week's video, I just have to say I don't know exactly what happened, but since recording the last video and now, well, the subscriber count just went through the roof. Not only hitting 1,000, and thank you to all who have noticed that in that last video, but it's kept going up. I think last time I saw it was about 1.5k subs. So welcome to all you new viewers, but particularly I want to thank many of you who have been along the pub test journey right from the start. Been hanging around here for 12 months, watching this channel change over time to get to where we are now, and let's see where this channel might end up. But genuinely, your viewing and everything is greatly appreciated. But I'm not here to do self-adulation. We are here to look at another case. And this is episode 6 in the Pub Test podcast. And we are going back to Germany and World War II. We're looking at the case of the S-Bahn murderer. Now, there's been a lot reported about this particular case, and people vary a little bit on minor details, but they all come to the one conclusion, that the S-Bahn murderer was caught. Well, what's the story? Who was he? Let's put it to the pub test. Now, our last case with Bruno Ludger occurred later in World War II and in more regional areas, whereas this one took place early in World War II and in the capital city, Berlin. Now, even that early on in the war, there were just atrocities happening everywhere. Now, we're not getting into a lot of the big atrocities that happened because of the Nazi regime, but bad things were happening in Berlin too. Like the British Air Force were dropping bombs across Berlin everywhere. So, because they didn't have GPS tracking and all this stuff, now you probably sit in a little control room and send off your bombs. Back then, you'd have to fly the plane, sight what you were targeting, and then let them go. So what the German authorities decided was that we're going to go to a blackout. And what it meant was, if you lived in Berlin, you had to put up blackout curtains. That was a requirement. And your lighting inside your house had to be really low lumens, really dull, and used sparingly. There were no street lights, so you were allowed to carry a torch, but not have it on all the time. But if you're coming up to a footpath or a sidewalk, you could shine your light. Maybe if you saw someone sketchy coming towards you, perhaps give it a quick flash to see who's coming towards you. But if you had used that light unnecessarily, well, there were severe penalties. Because they thought that if they could keep the place dark, it would be harder for the German bombs to hit their targets. I'm sort of thinking myself, if I'm a civilian, maybe I want them to hit their targets, because otherwise they might just indiscriminately drop bombs on my house. But, you know, that's a pub test for another time. But you would think that under these conditions that the community would all bandy together. You'd be at one. You'd be united because you're fighting a common enemy. And I would say that as a general rule that happened, depending, no matter which side of the fight you were on, whether it was in England, whether it was the United States, or here in Germany. Yet, in all three of those places, the United States, England, and Germany, there were people that took advantage of the situation. Particularly these blackout laws. As our person in today's case definitely did, well, it also happened in England and the United States, and they will be covered in later episodes. But it does boggle the mind, doesn't it, that people would take advantage in these situations. Now, the thing with the S-Bahn murderer, they say he was the quintessential serial killer, psychopath, and we could see the progression of his crimes as we go through this. So they say they began in 1939 near Rummelsburg's station. Forgive the pronunciations, it's German. I don't get English right, so bear with me, but there was a train station in this area, and there were what they called allotments, where you could do like tenant farming, but it wasn't like farming. They were little, like I would call them market gardens you see in cities today, where people could get a little patch of land, grow their vegetables or flowers, because you're living in an apartment, you don't get too much opportunity for that. So they had these little allotments that people could make use of. But then there was this bit of and he was known as a pest, starting with coming down the road either on foot or on a bicycle at night, and then just shining lights into people's eyes. Now, he risked a penalty for doing that, but this bloke found it fun. But then the fun started to go out of that situation. So then he would start not only shining the light at these poor women, but then grabbing them. And then at times attacking them, leading up to sexual assaults. So in effect, we have this serial rapist on the loose in Berlin here, in this little area. And you would think it wouldn't be that hard to catch, because everyone gave a description of a shorter person, receding black hairline, had prominent ears, and apparently his nose also was a defining feature. But the problem was, a lot of these crimes were happening in Germany at the time. See, many men were off at the war front. So a lot of women now were out on the street late at night, because they were now filling in the roles that the blokes used to do. So they were in the factories, they were in the offices. Like, life had to keep on going normal. And so labour was required. And some of these blokes who were left behind, well, they had this misogynistic view that every woman on the street was for their purposes only, and if they desired that, they could use them for whatever they wanted. And so a lot of these crimes went unreported. But not only that, the police were limited with the resources that they had. But then this attacker seemed to ramp up his crime, starting in August 13th of 1939. I believe the lady's name was Lena Wadinsky. And she was just walking home. And this bloke comes out of nowhere, chases her, hits her on the head, and stabs her 4 times. He runs off, but she survived. But she could provide no description of this particular attacker, so there was no link to the allotment serial pest, as he was known, and this particular attack. Then another woman not long after is walking home, and people are now getting in this area a bit concerned about this bloke who seems to be attacking women. Well, she's walking home, sees this bloke behind, and she starts booking it. She's running for her life. But old mate, he's tearing off after her too. He catches her when she's at her own door. She's just at the house that she needs to get into, but the door's locked. She's banging on the door, but he comes up and hits her. But she screams, and then he takes off. And again, not much of a description is made. No connection is made between the allotment pest and this particular perpetrator. But it would seem that this perpetrator begins to understand that he can't keep doing things the same way. He can't give up the fact that he's chasing these women because they're getting away. So he sees this young girl walking home, and he walks up to her and begins a conversation. She's very sketchy, but he's got that close. He pulls out his pocket knife and stabs her in the throat. Again, she screams, and he takes off. Fortunately for her, he missed the artery, and she also survived. She gave a similar description of the person who was the allotment serial pest, but the police are not really getting involved yet fully, because no serious crime has happened. That seems really odd. Being a serial rapist and now attempted murder on 3 occasions is not serious enough to really bring in the big dogs. But it is what it is, and we'll probably understand the reason why as we go through this story. And we go on to this 4th crime that happened near this particular train station in Berlin. A woman got strangled and then sexually assaulted. She was unconscious, and it's possible that this perpetrator thought the woman had passed away. But there's apparently, and I won't describe it, you can look it up, but you need to strangle someone for a certain amount of time before they die, otherwise they will come back. They're just unconscious. Well, she had no idea who this attacker was, but she also survived. Yet, there is a disturbing element to this particular attack in that it's possible that the person who did the strangulation was different to the bloke who did the other part of the crime. And there's something we're going to look at in that regard as we go through this as well. But now heaps more attacks were happening, not of such a grave nature, but just going back to being this serial pest around the allotments. But then on one particular night, the perpetrator goes up to this woman and begins to attack her. But what he didn't know was, because he couldn't see, remembering it's dark, so he didn't see in the shadows that this woman's husband and brother-in-law just happened to be nearby. And they haul off and start pounding this bloke senseless. Now, it's said that somehow he got away. Maybe that's the story these 2 blokes gave when they realised they had in their capture this serial pest. Because perhaps they thought, mate, he's had enough. We've beaten him stupid. But anyway, regardless, somehow they didn't take him down to the police station, and so this person was able to keep on committing his crimes. Again, an interesting sliding doors moment. Had they have not taken vengeance, and had they have taken him to the authorities, perhaps what happens next would never have eventuated. So this is where we move to the S-Bahn and the trains that were operating. Because this perpetrator then thought, well, I can't do these crimes out in the open, can I? Because what happens is either the women get away or I get caught. So then the idea is, why not perform these crimes in an enclosed area? In fact, there were little rooms on these trains in second class. Now, interestingly here, just so you know, it sounds second class. That doesn't sound so good. But on the S-Bahn, often the trains, the domestic ones, only had second class and third class. The first class were for a totally different train. But the third class had wooden bench seats, not much room, but second class had the little cabins, basically, with upholstered seating. So if you could get into second class, well, that was actually pretty fancy. But most people travelled third class because money was very, very tight. But the first real crime on September the 20th of 1940, a woman by the name of Gerda gets on the train. But she falls asleep and wakes up past her stop. So she gets off the train she's on and jumps on the next train heading back to her station. Now, she realises that means if someone comes up and says, ticket please, she doesn't have a ticket for the trip back. But then a person dressed in a railway uniform comes up and says, can I help you? And she quickly explains, look, I fell asleep. I'm just heading back. I don't actually have a ticket to be on the train. And he goes, that's not a problem. In fact, just so you don't get harassed by any other train staff, would you like to come with me in second class and I'll chaperone you until you can get off, and that way there'll be no problem. And she's thinking, well, this is great. Now, apparently she engages in small talk with this person, this train employee. But then something happened real quick. He jumps up and begins to strangle her. Now, obviously, she doesn't remember what happens next, so we'll take up the story from the perpetrator's point of view. He attacks this woman until she passes out. Now, he may have thought she died, remembering strangulation takes a little bit longer to kill someone than most people realise, and so she's unconscious. He drags her body, opens the door to the train, and launches her out. And it's said that the train was probably travelling around 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometres. You would assume that if the strangulation did not take the life of poor Gerda, then being thrown from this moving train would. Well, by some absolute stroke of fortune, she survived. Apparently, where he threw her out, there was just this bed of sand. Yes, she was badly injured, absolutely, but she lived. She went to the police upon getting some medical treatment and said, "There's this nutter who attacked me, threw me from the train," and they said, "Well, thank you for reporting it, but just a couple of questions if we may. Had you had any drinks that night?" She goes, "Well, I had a bit of alcohol, yeah." He goes, "Is there any chance you just got a bit drunk and fell off the train?" So, "No, this nutter threw me from it." They go, "No, look, you go home and, you just look after yourself. Maybe don't get on the drink before you get on the train." Seriously, that was the thought. There was no even remote possibility that there was a connection between this particular crime and the ones that preceded it, because the police did not believe that a crime had occurred. So I can understand now why many of these other attacks that women suffered, with these sexual assaults that were going on, may not have been taken seriously either, if they're not going to take this one. Yet, in the police's defense, about 80 people had already died because of accidents along the train line. And so they may have just thought this is another one, and she's just making up a story so she doesn't get in trouble from her employer or maybe family. Don't know. But regardless, this was discounted for a long time as even being an attack by the S-Bahn murderer. But still, for all the crimes, no one's lost their life yet. But then tragically, that changed when Gerda Ditter, a young mum, she was only 20 years old, had 2 kids. Now, the husband was off in the war. She met, supposedly, I say supposedly because she's not around to tell this story, but someone at the train station, a train employee. And they got talking. She invites him over to the house. Now, for what purpose? You can work that out yourself. But she lets him in the house. So, and in front of these 2 young kids, she gets strangled. But then to make sure, this bloke cuts Gerda's throat. Her body was found that day. And sadly, her children were due to be taken away from her that morning because of bad parenting. Like, child services were coming in to say, "No, we got to take your kids away." So they thought perhaps she may have taken her own life for that reason. But you can't strangle yourself and then cut your own throat. So then they realised, well, okay, that's not how that happened. So naturally they go after the husband first and find out he was nowhere near the area. So this was the first attack by the S-Bahn murderer. And that brought in the big dogs. The big police investigators were now interested in the crimes. Understandably, though, here, no connection is made between the attacks on the train and this particular crime. And we could understand why, because this was not on a train and it was largely different, particularly with the use of the knife. But then not long after this attack on Gerda Ditter, a similar attack happened to a woman on the S-Bahn. She was invited by someone dressed in a train uniform to second class. Before too long, he attacks her, strangles her, throws her from the train. She ends up in hospital for a couple of weeks, and after a couple of weeks, she's able to give a description to the police. Now, all of a sudden, that previous crime that they discounted, well, it would match so similar to this one that they have another look. And they realize they have a serial perpetrator on their hands. And because of the locality, they now start making a connection between Gerda Ditter and also the serial pest who attacked people at the allotments. But also this person had not just been going for strangulation, he'd been hitting people on the head, and it was with a lead cable. Now this lead cable was used on the railway, so he had an offcut of it, and they actually found this lead cable in one of these second-class carriages where the woman was attacked. Yet there were no fingerprints on it. And you might think, well, why would he leave that behind? And I'm saying here, if he did work on the railway, he had access to no doubt some leftover supplies where he could just go help himself to a few more. But leaving that there is interesting considering no fingerprints were on it. So this bloke was being very careful. And again, people point out that this is the progression of an organised serial killer. Starting with these petty crimes that he was doing around the allotments, ramping up to attacking, and then sexual assaults, and then attempted murder, until eventually he perfects it and is able to murder someone. Well, now he's probably realised, seeing in the papers 2 of his victims have survived. And so he realises he needs to change his approach again. And so on the 4th of December, 1940, very reminiscent of the Whitechapel killer Jack the Ripper, a double event happens. First, Elfrida Franke. She's on the S-Bahn, and she is attacked with someone hitting her over the head with this lead cable. It fractures her skull, and she's thrown from the train, where her body is found a few days later. And on that very same night, Irmgard Frieser, who was walking home and near this train station, she also got hit over the back of the head with this lead pipe. And then she was assaulted afterward. She didn't die instantly, but did succumb to her injuries in hospital the following morning. Now, eerily, people do make that connection between Jack the Ripper's double event and this particular one. And just on a side note, I've always thought that double event to be a very difficult thing to reconcile with Jack the Ripper, because I couldn't imagine someone doing a crime like that and then still feeling the need to go out and do another one. But in this case, it would suggest that that very well could have happened. But this then seemed to ramp up the crimes. On the 22nd of December, a woman, I think the name is Elizabeth Bungener, was found lying on the side of the railway track with her skull crushed, and she'd obviously been thrown from the train. On the 28th of December, Gertrude Seward, she was thrown from the train while still alive. She also died later in hospital. On the 5th of January 1941, another woman was thrown from the train alive who also died in hospital. And then perhaps even, like, all these were tragic, but Johanna Voigt, she was pregnant. She had 3 kids at home. They found her with her skull crushed, and she'd also been thrown from the train. Now you would think, how could someone perpetrate these crimes one after the other on the train and not get caught, and women not being alert to some of these low-life degenerates who might want to attack them? Well, the thing is that there was no press about any of these crimes. In fact, it was actively being suppressed because the propaganda machine in Germany didn't want any negativity in the press. They didn't want to make people a bit disheartened any more than they already were. So they said, you're not going to mention how these women are being murdered and being thrown from the train. Well, the main detective here, and he had a different title. I'm going to call him a detective. Detective Ludker. He says we need to do something. We can't allow these crimes to continue going on. So can we just put some press out? And so they're allowed a little bit. Just saying, look, you need to be careful. Some bad things are happening, without going into great detail of the nature of the crimes, being attacked in second-class cabin and then being thrown off the moving train. But they decide that they need to ramp up the security. So they have more police on the train, but then they try something. They get a female police officer as bait, and they put her on the S-Bahn train. And all they have is another officer nearby in another carriage, apparently. So he could come running if something happens. Now, she wasn't armed. She didn't have a gun on her, because apparently female officers were not trained in firearms. So now this is one brave woman, knowing that people have just had one hit and they have died. She is really risking a lot taking on this particular assignment. Well, it is on a night. She's on the train and she sees someone in the dark, remember, because the train had very limited lighting as well, start approaching her. And he starts moving a bit quicker towards her. She knows this is the S-Bahn murderer. And just before he attacks, something happened. He gets spooked. Maybe he sensed, hang on, this could be a police person. And he runs. She chases off after him as well, and he gets to the door of the train and jumps out of the moving train. I find that absolutely incredible, and what a brave person she was. Like, bad enough being in this carriage all by yourself with this nutter on the loose, but then you chase him after almost being attacked yourself. But then they realise that most likely this bloke is not just wearing a train uniform. He possibly is a train employee, because he may have been aware of the police operation. Well, because they almost caught the bloke, the police decide to dress male officers up as women and put them on the train. Again, similar to Jack the Ripper in Whitechapel in 1888, because they had done that to try and catch Jack the Ripper. But like in Whitechapel, here in Berlin, it came to no avail. But the last crime happened on the 3rd of July, 1941. It was Frieda Keusel. She was found near the allotments where the original crimes had begun, where she had been bludgeoned to death and sexually assaulted. Oddly though, during all of this, at one crime scene, they actually found footprints, and they matched the boots, because in Germany at the time, if you bought boots, like, boots were a premium. So shops were required to write down every person that bought a pair of boots, and they were able to identify a particular bloke's footprints, and they went and spoke to him, and he was a known sex offender, and he'd been near one of the bodies on the railway. So they bring him in, have a good conversation with him, and he said, look, I saw the crime happen, but it wasn't me. I just watched on. They believe him, and they let him go. It's possible that he may have been the person doing the assaulting after the person had passed away. They don't really investigate that, but they eliminate him as being the perpetrator. He obviously didn't report these crimes, and you might think that is very suspicious, but if you are already on that list, maybe you would not go to the police and say, I've seen some crimes, because they, back in Germany there, it was pretty fast justice, as we are going to see. But it's Detective Ludker. He decides, well, we're going to investigate all the train staff. They had eliminated many, but then they thought, we're going to change our questioning. We're going to ask them, do you suspect anybody? So they ask a particular bloke, and he goes, well, actually, there is one guy. He works in that signal tower. I've seen him take off and jump the fence when he's meant to be at work. So he disappears. I approached him and said, hey, what are you doing, mate? He goes, look, I'm going off to visit a woman who is not my wife for a bit of entertainment. Anyway, he's creepy, that bloke. So you need to go talk to him. Don't know his name, but he works over there. So Detective Ludka goes and brings in for questioning Paul Orgorzow. So who was this bloke? Well, he was born in 1912 as Paul Sager. He was illegitimate, which was an issue back in those days. Not exactly sure what happened with his mother, but at the age of 12, he was adopted by Henry Orgorzow, who was a farmer. So I would think that perhaps they needed help on the farm, and so getting a young boy, he can do some work. But apparently it worked out quite well because Paul took on the name of this farmer, and he ended up moving to Berlin when he got a bit older. And at the age of 19, he's in Berlin and he's working. Now, he joined the SA. Now, we often hear of the SS, but the SA were a pretty ruthless group of young people. And there were an element above who was controlling it, and the SA had a major part in getting the Nazi regime into power. But at the time in 1931, Adolf Hitler still had not actually taken control of Germany at this point. But most people remember these SA as brown shirts because that was the type of shirt that they wore. And if you saw them, you did not want to mess with them because they would, basically give you a good roughing up if they didn't like you. And you would think, why would anyone join a group like that? Well, you have to remember the appeal of Adolf Hitler to maybe some of these young blokes. See, they no doubt grew up hearing the stories of how good life was before World War I. But then Germany was under massive, heavy sanctions. And they're getting this idea that, hey, we don't need to do this. We are the superior race. We should be living a much, much better existence. And these young ones who have heard the stories would have said, yeah, I want to be part of that. And so that was the attraction for some of these. And it said that Paul Orgorzow, he did quite well and made a little bit of rank within this organisation. But he had a normal life as well. So he wasn't just this thug patrolling the streets. He got married, had 2 children, and his neighbours suggested he was just a normal bloke. He liked to water his plants, pick cherries from the tree, played with his kids in the yard. Well, again, we think these serial killers, they are the ones you least expect. The people next door. It's just so strange. But that was the impression that everyone had of Paul Orgorzow. Now, and the funny thing is, too, we don't know much about his history at all because his life was very plain. Nothing stood out. There was no animal cruelty in his past that we know of. There was no setting fires. Without any of that, the question would be, is this the bloke? Is this the S-Bahn murderer? Well, Detective Ludger began to unravel the facade of this nice family man. He said, look, we know you've been jumping that fence. We did check your alibi with this other woman you were carrying on with, and she says, yes, that was happening. But there's other dates that don't match up. And we know you've been doing these other attacks at the allotments too. They found blood on his uniform, and he says, well, look, it was a cut on my finger. That's where that blood came from. And also my wife had an illness. Now, I don't know if that's a lost in translation issue, but his wife does verify that, yes, that blood that was on his uniform came from her. So she must have had some injury as well. But Ludger keeps up the pressure. And this was the quintessential interrogation room that you see on shows. They're one light, no windows, very small, and they're boring into this bloke. And so he does confess to the allotment attacks. He says, all right, I did those crimes, but I didn't do the others. So they then ask him to take him to the allotments and show where the crimes occurred. So he does so. But what he doesn't know what they're going to do is actually bring some of the victims who survived to that allotment. And then in situation, they ask these people, is that the bloke who attacked you? And one says, absolutely, that is the lowlife. And the other one goes, look, I'm not really sure. But because of that positive ID, they're now getting convinced that Paul Orgorzow is the perpetrator. And when he takes them to a couple of the scenes at the train station, along the tracks, they know they've got him. Despite that, Orgorzow still maintains his innocence of the murders on the train. But then Detective Ludka says, we've got you. You need to help yourself here. Look, if you confess, we will look after you. We'll sort all of this out. And then they bring in 5 cleaned skulls and place them on the table in front of him. Now, whether these were 5 of the victims, I really don't know. But upon seeing these skulls, Paul Orgorzow cracks. Apparently he shakes visibly and then confesses to all of the crimes. He does then claim insanity, and he says it was a Jewish doctor. Yes, and remember, he was a part of the Nazi party, so probably suggesting a Jewish doctor had treated him for gonorrhea. Didn't go very well, may have curried him favour. He says it was that reason why I didn't get proper treatment. I became an alcoholic, and that's what caused me to commit these crimes. So I really need to be put into an asylum. That's where I need to be. So then he goes to trial. Now let's just quickly look at the timeline. The last attack happened on July the 3rd. So from his arrest to the trial and conviction, which happened on the 24th of July, we're only talking 3 weeks had passed by. And then on the 26th of July, 2 days later, Paul Orgorzow is executed by the guillotine. So when Detective Ludka said he would look after him, I don't know exactly what he meant. But certainly they didn't mess around when it came to justice and what would perhaps be the final insult to Paul Orgorzow's wife. Remembering she's just found out the bloke she was sharing a bed with and had 2 kids to had been cheating on her. Not only that, had been this serial pest and the S-Bahn murderer, and they send her a bill for the maintenance on the guillotine. They go, look, we had to perform this, job, but now, whatever work needs to be done so we can do it again, well, that has to be paid for somehow, so here's the bill. I have no idea how that poor woman would have felt in that moment, but I would suggest that was a rather callous thing to do, because she didn't do the crimes. So that is the story of the S-Bahn murderer. And that's the story you will hear in every book, every documentary, every podcast. It's all pretty well much the same except for a couple of minor little details. Yet for me, it does not pass the pub test. I'm telling you right now, I believe that Paul Orgorzow never did any of those crimes. And I know I'm in a club of one here. I have not found anybody even raise any suspicion of doubt about his guilt. But if I had have heard this story, and it's not just because of the death sentence, so that is a very final way of performing justice. But if you're wrong, there's no coming back from there. Now, if I had have heard this story and looked at it, and let me tell you, when I first went through looking at this particular case, because it was suggested to me, in the research, I'm thinking, this bloke is a lowlife. And then I started looking at it thinking, well, there's a chance he didn't actually do it. And even before this recording, I was thinking, I was sort of 60-40, yeah, he's guilty. And I'm like, but maybe not. 40% of me was saying he could be innocent. Well, now I've gone the whole other way. So if it was me, I would want to defend this bloke as his defense lawyer at trial, and I want you to be the jury and you tell me if my theory here passes the pub test, whether or not you think he's completely innocent, but can I convince you of reasonable doubt? Well, let's have a look. What is the first piece of evidence that I am going to present? The first thing was that he was jumping the fence to go and see a girlfriend, someone not his wife. They go and talk to that woman and she says, yes, I was having an affair with this bloke. Now, the bloke that saw him jump the fence, how many times did they say he did it every night? Well, he approached him once and said, where you going? And he told the truth. Now, there's another interesting aspect to this, which we are going to touch on. But the police now are suggesting that he jumped the fence every night. But that's not what the other person saw, and that's not what Paul Orgorzow said either. But that was an assumption made by the police that he was just taking off all the time, which I find difficult to believe. But we will get to that. Secondly, the blood found on his uniform. Now, his wife, probably after finding out he's been doing some shaboinky boinky with some other woman, still verifies that that is valid, that he cut his finger and somehow some of her blood ended up on the uniform. But remember, the bar that they found in the carriage where one of the women was attacked, well, they had no fingerprints on it. There was no blood in the carriage. In fact, they found no physical evidence in the train at all for any of the attacks. So if you were so meticulous as a criminal, as a serial killer, to make sure you left no evidence behind, why on earth would you leave some evidence on your uniform? It just doesn't make any sense to me. Then the other thing, everyone said that the serial pest at the allotments and everything was really short. So I just struggle here because height is relative. Like, I'm fairly short myself. But you see, if I went to a kindergarten, the kids there would think that I'm, well, at least fairly tall. Now, we only get the description of the people who survived the attacks, but what I'm saying is hitting someone on the head. Now, to bring down force, if you're taller than someone, well, that's easier to do. But if you've got to reach up and down, you don't get much force to knock someone out in an instant. So I'd be bringing up his height, saying he physically could not have perpetrated some of those crimes. It would just be impossible. Moving on to the identification of this poor bloke, they didn't do a lineup. They didn't give the eyewitnesses options. They said, do you think it's that bloke? And one said, I know it's him. And you know, it's interesting that there's actually a movement out there to eliminate all eyewitness testimony from trials, because eyewitness testimony is absolutely dreadful. I saw a case just the other day where a woman was convinced, 100% convinced, that the person who was up on trial for her attack was the guilty person, and her absolute certainty in that convicted the bloke, and he went to prison for 17 years until DNA showed it was someone else. And the good part to this story is that they now basically are friends, the person wrongly imprisoned and the person who was wrong. And they're the ones pushing for eyewitness testimony to be removed from trials. But interestingly, the other person could not be sure. And I actually think that's fair, because remembering there was very limited lighting on the train. Like, that was by law. You could not have got a really good look at the person, because even the policewoman who came very, very close to the perpetrator, well, she did not get a good description. She couldn't describe who it was. So I find that IDing without giving options and just placing them in the spot where you were attacked and asking, do you think it's him? Well, most people would say that's him because they want justice and they can be wrong. And then we look at the serial killer profile I mentioned before. There's nothing in his history that we know of that would even suggest that this was the type of thing that Paul Orgorzow could have done. But wasn't he a proud Nazi, part of the brown shirts, the SA? Well, this is also an interesting little detail. Yes, he was, and as I explained, there's good reasons as to why young people would have joined that movement. But then an event happened in 1934, which was known as the Night of the Long Knives. See, what happened was the SA basically said, we want to merge with the army. In fact, we want to take control of the army because the Nazi party had now come to power. The army weren't very happy with that, and they said, look, we can't have these nutters controlling it. And it wasn't just Adolf Hitler who was like running the show. So the group of them, like the committee, they get together and go, we need to bring these people into line, the SA. They're getting a little bit too big for themselves. So the Night of the Long Knives, the SS, went around and basically chopped the head off the snake. They murdered at least 100 people who were high up in the SA. Some reports say it could have been up to 1,000 people were taken out, and in the press it was said this was to bring stability to the government because it was possible that the leader of the SA was maybe trying to take Adolf Hitler's position. Well, Paul Orgorzow was nowhere near being on the list to be attacked as part of the SA. He was very low down the list. He was just a foot soldier for them. And the SA did stay in operation, but obviously under a totally different hierarchy structure. But he wasn't this big, important person in the Nazi Party at all. But with that in mind, there is a very intriguing detail. Detective Ludker, he did not like Nazis. When he started in the police force, he was actually trying to prosecute and capture and arrest the brown shirts for the crimes that they were committing on the street. So when the Nazi party came into power, that put him in a very awkward position because the Nazis made sure that if you were a good loyal soldier before they got into power, well, you were looked after. And if you were an opposer, well, things may not work out so good for you. And they went to Ludker and said, you need to join the Nazi party or you don't have a job. And he goes, well, okay, I'll sign up under those conditions. Yet he was still fairly vocal in his opposition to the Nazi party. Obviously not too vocal or you'd just be silenced, but they effectively sidelined him. They would not let him investigate any important crimes like political crimes, which were more important than some of these murders that were going on. But he had to make a bit of a name for himself to perhaps curry favour with the authorities. And it's interesting. Nobody wanted to believe that a German person would be doing these crimes. It had to have been a foreigner. It had to have been a Jewish person. Though it worked out it could not have been a Jewish person because they were so controlled. They wouldn't have even been on the train at that time of night. They weren't allowed to. So they had to eliminate them. But what satisfaction do you think that Detective Ludker would get from convicting a brown shirt, a card-carrying member, a proud card-carrying member of the Nazi Party? And maybe, total speculation, it had run-ins with this bloke in the past as well, back in the days when he was prosecuting these brown shirts. Yes, there was a good reason as to why Detective Ludker could very well have gone after this bloke. And remember, he made a promise. He said, I will look after you in that interrogation room. Now, if you are an aficionado of true crime, you know that when the cameras are on today, they go, when you are making a confession, they say you haven't been pressured, we haven't made any promises, and the person goes, yep, no pressure, no promises. He was pressured and he was promised. So I think that confession needed to be struck out. And as regards the time, how long he was away from that signal tower. So it was a double-story building. Apparently it's no longer there anymore. But it wasn't automatic. You had to be there. You had to turn the signals. And a quick Google search. I'll just read what it says about the job of a signal operator in Germany. It said, during World War II, Germany railway signal operators played a crucial role in supporting the war effort, ensuring the safe and efficient movement of trains and supplies across the country. And it goes on. Crucial role. Not the type of job where you can just turn up and bundy off when you feel like it or have a sleep. Now, if you've been a signal operator for a while and you knew the train schedule, you probably worked out, look, I've got about 20 minutes. It's a 3-minute run to that house. I'll let her know to leave the door unlocked. I'll get in and out and back before the next train arrives. I could see that as a legitimate scenario. I cannot see how a bloke, as a signal operator, can just take off willy-nilly for hours. It would have had to have been hours at a time. Surely to goodness someone would have seen him missing. And that leads me to one other major piece of evidence which I think no one's ever thought of. And that's simply that the night the bloke who went to attack the policewoman jumps off the train, then there's a massive gap. So it's February to July before the next attacks. And people say, well, that's because he got spooked, the police were onto him, and therefore he had to wait until Detective Ludker said we're no longer investigating this, because he'd put that in the papers to try and lure the person back out to do another attack. Because remembering, he needed to get a conviction to curry favour with the people that didn't like him. Well, there's probably a good reason as to why the attack stopped for a little bit amount of time. Because if you jumped from that train, there was a possibility you would die. Now, a few of the women did get thrown from the train and survived, but they were in hospital and they had serious injuries, and actually long-term injuries. One of them still suffered from headaches for the rest of her life. Now, did no one, the police that is, go to Paul Orgorzow's wife and say, on this particular night in February, did your husband's uniform come home all ripped up? Was he sort of busted around a little bit? Like, was he limping? Did they go to the hospitals and say, did some bloke dressed in a railway uniform present to the hospital? See, none of that was done. Now, surely, if that was the case, Orgorzow's wife would have known, he is this serial killer. But there was no mention of that. He would have needed time off work. There's no mention of that. I can't see how the bloke who jumped off the train could have just gone on about his daily life without anyone noticing a thing. And even when he's confessing, they said, okay, how did you do these crimes? He said, well, I murdered him with my hands. And they go, no. Well, that was part of it. But what about the rest? I used a knife. They go, well, yeah, maybe. And what else? Did I hit him with a club? Yep, now you got the trifecta. Great. So you are the person we're looking for, and you've done all of these crimes. Yet the MO was different for many of them. Different locations, different ways they were being attacked. See, they weren't all thrown from a train. Some were on the streets. And yet everyone just said all of these tie together. And the other thing is, and which seems to also get missed, is that when he went back to the crime scenes, unlike serial killers who basically revel in walking people through what they did and they like revisiting them, he was visibly shaken. He couldn't handle it. It doesn't sound like the normal reaction of someone who's committed these horrendous crimes at all. And I would say you've been under who knows how much pressure and how long you've been in the interrogation room, and they are hounding away at you. And if you do follow true crime, you know a good person will confess eventually when they get broken, even if they've never done the crime at all. Well, imagine sitting in that room and someone shoves 5 skulls underneath your face. I like to think I'm a relatively strong person, but I think that would break me. I think I would maybe give in. I don't know. I'd hope not. But I can see how that particular event, after all this pressure, would have got to him. And remember, when he confessed, he was visibly shaken. That's in the official reports. And have we forgotten about the sex offender whose footprints were found at the crime scene, that they said, well, he probably had nothing to do with these crimes, even though it is suggested that maybe he perhaps did the sex offending to one of the dead bodies. That is a possibility. But no, it wasn't him. He didn't do these crimes. They let him go. Well, now, I rest my case. I just don't think this bloke was the S-Bahn murderer. But let me know what you think. Do you think it passes the pub test? Is there evidence out there that I have missed? And to all the new viewers of the pub test, yes, we can have robust conversations in the chat, but we do like to keep it respectful. There's nothing wrong with having a disagreement, but we just don't take it too far. We just like to have that chat like we're sitting around the pub talking to our mates. But I'd be very interested to know what you think of this, because I've not seen anyone present any dissenting view to his guilt. And I just can't see how he did it. But as I mentioned at the start, the channel just went through a bit of an uptick, so welcome to all the new viewers, and thank you so much for all of you who have been here for the long journey and doing the likes, doing the subscribes, and sharing the content. It is genuinely appreciated. And the next video out will be, as promised, a return to the Jack the Ripper videos, and I'll be looking at the Polish Jew theory in its entirety. At this stage, it will be one video, but it keeps growing, so it may end up having to be broken up into a couple, but keep an eye out for that. And if you don't want to miss it, well, make sure you subscribe. But thank you very much for watching. It truly is appreciated. I'm Owen. You've been watching the pub test, and we will see you on the next one.